Good evening. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Mbali Nwoko, and welcome to the Private Property Farming Podcast on this Thursday evening. Thank you at home for constantly choosing the Farming Podcast every Tuesdays and Thursdays night at 8 o'clock. And thank you for also supporting all the other podcasts that we have throughout the week as well as on the weekend. Today we're talking about creating food systems along the agricultural value chain. So typically people tend to think that agriculture is purely based on farming or specifically focused around farmers. However, we tend to forget the other industry role players and stakeholders that play a critical role in the agricultural value chain. And having us today to just unpack this topic of creating food systems along the agricultural value chain is Jerome van Innes, who's the partner and co-founder of BeyondSoil. But before I get to him, I just want to encourage you to constantly share this video, ask questions if you have any questions for our guest tonight, and obviously just interact with us time and time again. Even if you catch this video on our YouTube channel post the live, we're definitely here for you to answer all your farming or agricultural needs. And also, before I introduce Jerome, I just want to send a shout out to all the farmers who are just in the system and are doing their best to grow their businesses in very tough economic times. I've been speaking to a few farmers earlier on this week, and there's just a general trend or mood right now where everybody's just trying to remain above waters and just really do the best that they can. And now that we're going into a new season in winter, typically things tend to get a bit slow. However, I just want to constantly encourage all those farmers who are just doing their best in their businesses, employing people, and really just trying to grow and maintain and sustain their businesses during this global pandemic. But let's just get on in today's topic, and I welcome Jerome. Thank you so much for joining us, Jerome. How are you doing?
Thank you, everybody. Very well. Yourself?
Awesome. I'm so excited to have you on the show because I know a bit about what you do, and from our conversations, I definitely enjoy the viewpoints in which you have around the industry and how the industry should be based on, the number of clients that you've worked with, the experience that you've had in the industry. So thank you for joining and allowing us to maybe pick your brain on tackling such a very complex topic that not many understand on how we create sustainable agricultural food systems in the sector. But before we get to deep dive in our topic today, I just want you to just give us a brief background, Jerome, of who you are and what does BeyondSoil do?
Yes, sure. Thanks a lot, first of all, for having me tonight. I'm quite excited to share, and I'm excited to share about my passion about the agricultural and the food sector in general. So I have a bit of an unusual background, I would say. First of all, as you can tell, I'm clearly not South African, right? I'm actually from Belgium, and I'm a Francophone person. So that's why you hear a strong accent in the background. But I have an unusual background in that I worked for a number of years in large corporates. So I worked for large consumer good companies, consulting companies. But I decided about 4 years ago to make the shift to the sector. And I moved to Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, I work for an agency called the Ethiopian Agricultural Transformation Agency. And really, my mission there was really trying to develop a series of novel ideas to do exactly this, transforming the food systems in Ethiopia, supporting the emergence of smallholder farmers and subsistence farmers, and help them graduate into the commercial sector. After that experience for about 3 years, and actually meeting my co-founder Zaheer in Ethiopia, I moved to South Africa, and that's where we started BeyondSoil. So just to give you a very brief introduction about BeyondSoil, to put it very simply, what we do in the sector is we grow SME in the agricultural sector and the food sector broadly, right? So what typically our experience tells us in terms of really pain points that entrepreneurs in the sector face, be it in primary production, secondary production, or any activity along the value chains, are threefold. The first one is that, like SMEs across the world, even in my home country, Belgium, entrepreneurs typically do not have the type of capabilities or all the capabilities to scale a business. They are excellent at farming, they are excellent at producing food, for example, but they lack a little bit of capabilities on the side to scale an agribusiness. The second pain point we also aim to tackle, and which is, I would say, one of the biggest hurdle in South Africa when it comes to growing the value chain, is access to finance, right? And the third element is very often also the SMEs involved in the value chains are typically excluded from key value chain relationships. So concretely, they don't always have access to the top suppliers when it comes to sourcing the right type of inputs. They don't always have access to the Pick and Pay, the Woolies, or if they do, it's not always at the same sort of level playing field. And finally, they also typically a bit access to sort of mentors and people to support them along their growth journey. So that's essentially what at BeyondSoil we do. We aim to grow agri-SMEs and solving these three specific pain points.
So tell me, Jerome, do SMEs come directly to BeyondSoil, or are you working with corporates who have then relationships with SMEs that wish, that have a vested interest to grow the SMEs? So how does it work?
Yeah. So the first answer at this point in time is we approach, or SMEs approach us in terms of support, right? So the initial businesses we've supported typically were introduced via some of our key partners in the sectors. But what we're looking at doing actually in the near future is then working directly with larger players, typically what we would call corporates, and support these corporates actually sourcing from these SMEs and growing these SMEs, right? So we want really to tackle this problem of growing SMEs from both angles, both directly with the SMEs themselves and helping them connect with off-takers and corporates, but also supporting the corporates who have a significant role to play in the value chain to grow the SMEs that they work with and that they source product from.
Right. Let's take me back to your days in Ethiopia, right? Because I think it's always nice to have a look at what other African countries are doing and bring it back home and, just, really deep dive into that case study to obviously improve our operations locally. So when you were in Ethiopia, which type of stakeholders or partners were you working with to support and help smallholder farmers, and what type of challenges maybe did you experience with smallholder farmers there that is similar or maybe different to farmers in South Africa?
So two things here. I think the first thing I want to do is paint a bit of a picture of what agriculture looks like in Ethiopia. And another thing is talk about the first question that you asked, which is what type of work did we do in Ethiopia, and what kind of stakeholders were we interacting with? So when it comes to Ethiopia, you pretty much need to forget about commercial agriculture, right? Ethiopia is significantly a citizens farming country. Farming makes up 40% roughly of the GDP, so it's a significant chunk of the economy. But imagine that essentially in Ethiopia, the average farmer, which is a smallholders, and they are 98% they represent 98% of all the farmers in Ethiopia. An average smallholders typically has a field of about an hectare, right? Typically, they also farm with an ox or with a donkey, and they use a similar sort of animal to use as a mode of transport. So it's a very, very rudimentary agriculture that I would say is you don't really come across in South Africa. except in very specific rural settings for subsistence farmer. But again, that's the predominance of the Ethiopian agricultural sector. So the kind of stakeholders we work with at the Ethiopian Agricultural Transformation Agency is essentially the government. Because again, the government has a significant role in the development of or takes a significant role in the development of the economy. And what we were doing there is essentially, as you're mentioning, and the key topic of today is how do we develop the food systems within Ethiopia, right? And the idea was to take a very strategic approach from looking at the entire value chains and identifying what were the significant bottleneck to growing the sector in the country. And then one by one, tackling the biggest bottleneck at one time, then trying to identify the specific root cause for that bottleneck, trying to develop a series of models, approaches, etc., to solve it, and then go pilot and implement that overall. But the bottleneck there are quite different from what you would expect here in South Africa, right? It's essentially to do agriculture, one needs access to infrastructure, and very simply road, port to export if you do exports, access to electricity and water. So these were some of the primary challenges that we encountered in Ethiopia.
And how important is the role from government when it has to come to creating sustainable food systems? You spoke about roads, infrastructure, and we also struggle with that here. You know, many farmers in the South African context are diversely dispersed. People farming in peri-urban areas or in rural areas. I mean, we have load shedding nowadays. Yeah. You know, it's very difficult to run a farming business with electricity disruptions. We have farmers who are placed very far from the local markets, etc. And then you talked about the financing aspect, you know.
Right.
And just the stringent processes that banks give to farmers. And obviously banks are also regulated as well. So how important is the role that government plays in creating sustainable food systems?
So the government has essentially a very, very critical role, a very central role, right? And first of all, I don't think personally that the government should take a very active role in the production of food and agriculture, etc. What the government should do is create an enabling environment where all the fantastic entrepreneurs in this sector will essentially have the tools to go and build their business. And you mentioned a few elements, right? First of all, the role of a government is obviously to provide access to infrastructure. So access to infrastructure, we're talking about roads. If you have limited access to a road, how can you bring your produce to market? That's the very first basic element. You talk about electricity. Similarly, a stable supply of electricity is extremely important, even more so, I would say, in more advanced part of the value chain. When you start talking about processing, transformation of agricultural produce into ingredients, into food produce, or into all sorts of material for other industries, right? So electricity is key. The third element in terms of infrastructure that the government has to also provide for is access to water, right? And mostly at a macro level, not so much at a micro irrigation level, but providing the right level of infrastructure, dams, water retention system, and so on and so forth. So that's at a very sort of specific infrastructure level. There's another element which is also around all the legal aspects. So creating an enabling environment where people want to come and invest into the sector. Mm-hmm. So typically one of them would be around land and the security of land, right? Making sure that, for example, when land reform happens and when farmers get access to land, well, this land actually can be leveraged, for example, to raise funding. And for that, they need essentially access to the title deed. They need to be the owner of the land in order to use that as a collateral. So that element is very important as well. For export, again, that's an area where the government can play a significant role by essentially opening trade routes for the producers, for the exporters, by negotiating trading agreements. And then finally, and you touch also on that point, which is very important, is around access to finance. And that's something that we feel very strongly about. You can have all the skills in the world, but if you don't have any capital to put into your assets, being your tunnels, your tractors, or to buy an extra piece of land, if you don't have capital to buy your seeds up front, well, simply you can't do anything. You may be the best farmer of the world, but you can't put anything into production. So access to finance is something that obviously I wouldn't say should be the role of the government in itself, but the government should facilitate that. And at some part of the value chain early on, at some part of the development of agri-SMEs early on, they should also provide the right mechanism in order to reduce the cost of finance for early stage agri-SMEs. So the government, and I touch only a few of the topics, but the government has a significant role in the growth of the agricultural food systems. But I would also say, always with a caveat, the government shouldn't intervene too much, right? What you want to make sure as well is that you create the space for entrepreneurs to thrive, and you create a level playing field where for smaller entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs that have been historically disadvantaged, you give them an extra support, because the traditional large commercial agribusinesses over the last century have received significant support. So that's what the government is in my personal views, sort of should do, really creating that strong enabling environment for everyone to thrive.
Wow, I just loved how you really unpacked that term enabling environment, because we hear that quite often. We always hear government must help, government must be interactive, government must be robust. And I like how you just unpacked that term enabling environment, because often people then ask, what is an enabling environment? And I like how you've just broken it down to say it's simple things like just getting road infrastructure into place. People are talking about how data is so expensive, maybe, communicating with the telecoms companies to make data cheaper and more affordable, because, farming is obviously moving, or actually has moved, to a lot of technological advances that rely on data, providing markets, access to markets, also just trade agreements. These are things that a farmer like myself can't go and discuss with our neighboring countries. You need government stakeholders and role players to obviously create, to start those conversations and create something that will make it viable for farmers like myself to trade with a farmer in Ethiopia, for example. And also, in the topic of agriculture and farming, time and time again, we always put a spotlight on access to finance and how critical finance is in growing a business. Where do you think farmers are getting it wrong, especially on that topic around access to finance? Is it, are we not investing enough in our businesses that allows us to always struggle? Or is it when we're making sales, are we not saving enough? Or are we going into the industry just wanting grant funding and starting our businesses basically on grants, which I believe, is the wrong approach? And how can we just basically position ourselves to make to ease the financial burden a bit? Because time and time again, we're always talking about the problem is access to finance, access to finance, access to finance. But how can we really, I suppose, win where access to finance is concerned and really find ways around to really growing sustainable businesses that could contribute to food security with finance really not being a problem?
Yeah, I would say my first comment is to all farmers out there and entrepreneurs, don't beat yourself up, right? That access to finance and raising money is an issue that everyone across the world faces, right? I come from Belgium. There are probably a few more options when it comes to access to finance, that's for sure. But again, if you're a small business and a farmer is a small business, you will face these issues, right? So that's my first comment. The other thing is that there's a structural issues we believe there's a structural issues when it comes to the financial systems and the products that exist out there for farmers, right? But that's a separate topic. So I think your question was a lot more around what can farmers and more broadly entrepreneurs in the sectors do to sort of solve that problem to access to finance, right?
Yes.
I think for us, what's really important is really strong financial management of your business. So all the farmers we meet, they tend to say, we love farming, we want to be out there in the field, etc. And I get it, and it's great. But at some point, you're also managing a business, and for that, I would say finance is like your blood, right? It's like blood oxygen. It's the essence of your business. Without any money, you can't farm. You can't do anything, unfortunately. So the very first step for me starts with being very clear about planning, and planning in a fairly detailed way before your production. For example, what are my planned revenue? What are my planned costs? What is my planned profit margins? That is something that is very important. We also very often talk about cash flow. Cash flow is essentially the pure cash you hold at the end of the month, right? You have expenses and you have revenues, and the difference between the two of them will be your cash flow. Obviously, you can be a very profitable business, but within certain period of time, you may essentially have negative cash flow. That means you essentially bleed cash. So that is very important for farmers to understand some of this concept, to educate yourself about some of the basic financial process, and go plan your financial. Then as you go and farm, keep track of them, and then afterwards sort of look back at your financials and identify what are potentially the drivers for you to increase your revenue and the drivers for you to decrease your cost. That's, I would say, are purely the basics. The next thing is once you have a certain handle on your finance and your revenue streams and your cash flow, what's really important for me is then building a sort of financial track records with investors, right? So there's no point in saying 2 months before signing a transaction for a new farm or buying a pack house to suddenly go and scramble and try to reach to ABSA, the land bank, to raise 15 million rand. If you have not built a relationship with the bank, it simply is not going to work. So really what's important for me is step by steps, you build that track record. So taking a very simple example, you may be a profitable farmer. Why not starting taking a simple financial product like a working capital loan to pay for your seeds at the beginning of the season? And then you work your way, you start reimbursing that loan, you build a relationship with your banker. And then over time, as you build this relationship with your banker, as you essentially prove your ability to reimburse the debt that you have taken, your banker will be more and more inclined to loan bigger amount of money. So that's very much the approach we at BeyondSoil take with our entrepreneurs. What we work with them up front is first the strategy. Where is it that they want to be? Where is it that they are right now? Then we plan that route. And very specifically, we identify the different building blocks for them to progressively get to that stage. So at the beginning, a small expansion of the production with an objective of generating a bit of cash flow. That part of the cash flow can be reinvested into the business. Then afterwards, the next cycle, let's take a little bit of debt, for example, to start that track record. The third steps would be, okay, once we have a first track record, let's take some assets finance debt. For example, to buy an extra vehicle or to put an extra couple of tunnels onto the farm. And really over time, what you do is really building your financial track record. I think that for me are some of the most simplest steps that one could take. And then there's the question of how do we fix structurally also access to finance on the other side from the financial institutions point of view.
Sure, Jerome, everything that you're saying is actually hitting home, and that's something we just I know, for example, myself, I just don't think about it that way. Typically, I was born and raised in an environment where debt was considered to be bad. And so just as a person, I don't like owing people money. I don't like credit. And it's just, I think what you're saying is that also we as entrepreneurs, we need to grow out of our comfort zones. We need to grow out of the way we've done things for years and years, and just find a different approach to life and to business. And I like the way that you mentioned that we definitely need to start developing a relationship with the bank. Someone could say, okay, my business is profitable. I don't need credit cards. My debts have been paid off. But not knowing that a bit of debt is actually improving your credit record. A bit of debt is creating a bit of relationship with a bank. And I know from talking from personal experience, how important it is to have a bit of debt within your business or on a personal aspect. Going around to say, I don't have debts, all my bills are paid off. That's great. But in essence, the financial markets actually just want to see a bit of debt, especially when you're applying for funding.
Yeah, and it goes a bit beyond just the track record, right? It's very important. So we need to separate ourselves from our personal life and our business lives, right? I don't like debt. I'm like you and Bali, right? I think no one likes debt. When it comes to the end of the month, you don't want to put money towards paying the banker. But as a business, debt can be good, but you need to be wise about debt. So think about it this way. If your business is profitable and you earn every year 100 rand, you potentially could put this 100 rand back into your business and grow progressively, steadily, in a really nice way. Now, what about if you were to use that 100 rand and get an extra 100 rand of debt? Suddenly you double your investment every year, right? And that doubling of your investment helps you to grow more, to grow your revenue, and also making sure that you master your cost, grow your bottom line, grow your profit. So it's really, debt is also an instrument to accelerate your growth, to do bigger production faster, to professionalize your organization. And I think it's an important element because remember, not every SME wants to grow, but the highest potential SMEs really can become large agribusinesses within the next 5 to 10 years. But to serve the sophisticated buyers, as I call them, the likes of Woolies, or to export, for example, grapes to Belgium, because we have grapes in South Africa. What you need is you need to be able to produce a certain quantity and a certain quality on a recurring basis. And that requires you to invest a lot into your land, into your biological assets, into your organization, your teams, your tools, and so on and so forth. So really, to achieve that kind of professionalism, if you aspire to become a large commercial agribusiness, debt can be useful. But again, it's about planning, and it's about really financial discipline in how you raise and repay debt.
Still on the topic of finances, but moving a bit away from banks and bringing more investors and shareholders into the space. You mentioned that, creating debt could also accelerate a bit of your growth in your business, whether you're a farmer, whether you're a buyer and seller, an agro-processor, any entrepreneur in the food system or in the agricultural value chain. At what stage do we have those conversations, maybe with shareholders and investors? Like you said, an entrepreneur could be running a successful enterprise and you're saying, have a bit of debt to accelerate that growth. But if an entrepreneur is deciding, maybe the bank is not the avenue, I am looking at accelerating my growth, maybe by bringing an investor. What are the things to look out for there when we're talking about investors and shareholders, and what type of relationship should we start having with potential investors and shareholders?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. I would say for me, first of all, choose wisely your investor, right? I think it's quite important. It's an interesting avenue for you to grow. But again, I would say it's mostly interesting for businesses that are on a strong growth trajectory, that really want to grow fast and that really want to go far. And yes, it is important in that case then to have a partner. But what's really important is choose wisely your investors. What you get with equity is not just money. You actually get also someone that's going to live with you this adventure, right? So typically, if I were to raise money for my own business, I want a strategic investor. And by strategic investors, I mean someone who, first of all, share my vision or can enrich my vision, right? It's not that I'm entirely right, but if I have certain values and I like operating my business in a certain way, and I'm aiming for certain objectives, I want at the very least these investors to share that. And also, I want these investors to be able to contribute, not just in money, but also in a series of other add-ons. So very concretely, you could very well have an investor that, for example, is an existing producers or processors of a certain type of produce, and they're interested in taking a stake in you because they see that you will be able to supply them with the right type of produce. So that typically is an investors that is aligned to you, right? It's not just purely a financial investors. So I think that's the first advice I have. And then the other things when it comes to investors is obviously anything around what you call valuation of your business, anything around what you call exit of your business. You also want to be very clear about for how long do you want these investors to be in your business. And if you get someone into your business, how do you either exit the business and sell your stake to someone, or how do you get this person to exit the business? Because this person will expect at some point a return on the money they've invested, and they'll ask you potentially to buy back, for example, their stake in your company. So there's a lot more, obviously, but these are some of the initial consideration I would have when it comes to bringing an investors in the form of equity into your business.
Yeah, just to sum up our conversation this evening, Jerome, thank you so much for all these important topics that you've highlighted. They definitely hit home, and I'm sure it's also ringing a bell and to the audience watching tonight. But having the experience that you have, and obviously worked in Ethiopia, coming to South Africa, and also working to the agri sector. What are the opportunities that you've seen that not a lot of people are taking advantage of in this food system? Is there? I mean, obviously, there's more need for farmers. We all know that. But what are the opportunities? Are there more opportunities in management consulting? Similar to what BeyondSoil is doing. Is there more opportunities for financiers to have very innovative entrepreneurs to come up with a fintech problem that could solve agri problems? Policy making. I don't know. I'm just calling things out here. But what are the opportunities that you've seen within the South African landscape, and I suppose maybe make it broader in the African context, where you've seen across the food system? Yeah.
I mean, first of all, I think South Africa is an exciting place to be when it comes to agriculture and the food sector. And the reason why is I would say South Africa is a powerhouse when it comes to food production. Many of the products that we have on our shelves in Europe come from South Africa. So definitely there's a lot to do in that space. But I would say agriculture is still fairly done in a traditional way, right? And with a mentality of more of an SME, and in that sense of still fairly traditional. So for me, the sector is very rife with opportunities for doing things differently, and can be anywhere along the value chains. Whether you are in primary production, let's start thinking about ways of farming differently, farming more smartly when it comes to water consumptions, to using potentially less chemicals. If you are into primary production, let's think about the produce that the market is looking for abroad. So we're thinking a lot about fruits or superfruits. That's something that's really important. The second element for me is later down the value chain. What's really important is also how do you capture more value out of this produce? And in agriculture, produce a lot of potential ingredients that are very interesting. And I think it could lead to a lot of different industries that are interesting. Take an example for hemp. Hemp is something that can be easily grown in some of the dryland areas. And hemp, if it was transformed, can find its way all the way into construction industry, for example, for insulation of the buildings. So these are, again, value chains that are not fully developed. And for a country like South Africa, it could be extremely exciting because suddenly you're not into primary production or simple processing. You start really developing entire value chains that are adding lots of jobs, creating lots of value. Now, when it comes to entrepreneurs that want to put to use the technology, again, there are plenty of space. When it comes to access to finance, how do we essentially disrupt the existing banking model? What type of fintech solution can we do? When it comes to, for example, alternative to animal proteins, what is it again that we can do in this sector? There are innovative ways of, for example, processing grains and vegetables into burgers and these kind of things. So there's really a series of opportunities across the sector, being in primary production, in secondary production, in agricultural technology, as we call it, agtech. There is also in fintech. So quite an exciting space to be in. I would say for me is more choose a niche you want to be in and be extremely good at it, and go for it. Have big ambitions and work hard to achieve your ambition. And I think one important thing is find the right partners. Surround yourself with the best and brightest, the best partners to really work with you and help you to get to the next level.
Yeah, I see that. My last question for you, Jerome, I don't want to take too much of your evening tonight, is that at what stage do entrepreneurs or agripreneurs in the agricultural sector or in the food system come to work with BeyondSoil? Is it only when things are going good within their businesses, or when they're experiencing challenges? At what stage within the business do entrepreneurs approach BeyondSoil?
I would say we position ourselves much more as an accelerator of growth, as opposed to sort of trying to fix the issues, right? So for me, what's really important is we want to work with businesses that already have a little bit of track record, that already have all the basics in place, but have the potential to grow, right? So we primarily work with the best and brightest entrepreneurs, the people that have the grit, that extreme motivated to grow and scale rapidly. And at that stage, that's where we come in and can provide the additional support. In some instances, there's a set of issues and turning around. We're not opposed to that, but really what we want to do is, our vision is really to create a series of large agribusinesses, new agribusinesses, by supporting high potential agri-entrepreneurs.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time this evening, Jerome. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, and I'm sure the audience at home enjoyed the conversation as well. It's a bit quiet this evening. Nobody has commented, and I believe that everybody's just been listening to every single word that you've been saying, because you spoke from a very high and strategic level, which we don't really typically unpack in the show. Sometimes people just want to know, how do we go into farming? How do we start? But sometimes we miss the bigger picture, that there's so many elements in an agribusiness that obviously needs to be taken care of. We are entrepreneurs, we are running businesses, and it's important that we grow businesses that can scale, businesses that can be sustainable and live beyond the entrepreneur. And I mean, as I typically say, that the lifespan of entrepreneurs is between 3 to 5 years, and that's pretty much the time in which many businesses don't even reach 3 years in operation. And so everything that you've said tonight definitely has hit home. I think for me, my biggest learning curve is to say, definitely start creating a relationship with financial institutions when looking at investors. take your time in picking the right investors, and for the entrepreneur, it's basically understanding your business and where you want to take it, and then have individuals or partners or advisors like BeyondSoil to get you to that space, to that place, little by little, through just doing taking small steps within the business to obviously grow from there. So thank you so much for your insights this evening. And I don't know if there's any last words that you want to share with us this night.
No, thanks for having me. Maybe there are no questions because people did not understand my accent, but who knows? I would say, again, kudos to all the entrepreneurs there. We at BeyondSoil ourselves are entrepreneurs, and there are days where indeed it's not easy and you feel a bit lonely. So once again, just find the right people to bounce ideas, to encourage you. It's really important. Don't feel lonely. Just keep at it, and hopefully you'll succeed.
Wow, thank you so much. That was Jerome van Ennis, co-founder of BeyondSoil, which is a consulting company that is pretty much playing within the agricultural landscape, assisting SMMEs to grow their business. I think not mostly from an incubation perspective, but just to accelerate agri-businesses and assisting you as an entrepreneur with any challenges that you might have from a mentorship perspective, approaching clients, getting into proper value chains, getting into proper procurement lists for very, very established companies, as well as having a good financial relationship with banks or financial institutions, but growing your business beyond you, the entrepreneur. If you missed tonight's conversation, you will definitely watch it on our YouTube channel post this live. And be sure to tune in next week for another jam-packed session of the Farming Podcast brought to you by Private Property. But until then, I wish you a very good night and have a lovely weekend ahead. Thank you so much.